The letter wasn't slid under my door or placed politely in my mailbox. It was taped to the flagpole itself. Taped with so much cheap, clear packing tape that it looked like the pole had a vulgar, plastic tumor growing on it. The afternoon sun baked the adhesive into a gummy, irreversible mess. It was a message, of course. Not just the words typed on the paper, but the act itself. An act of petty violation, of deliberate disrespect. It was meant to be seen, to be understood as a display of power. Her power. I stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, the grass still damp from the morning sprinklers, and I just looked at it. I didn't touch it yet. In my old job, the first rule of any incident investigation was to observe. Don't touch, don't move, don't contaminate the scene. Just watch. Let the situation reveal itself. My old job was inspecting aircraft failures for the Federal Aviation Administration. I analyzed stress fractures in fuselage panels and traced the cascade of systems failures that could turn a $10 million machine into a crater in a cornfield. I was, by trade and by temperament, a man who understood how things break. And looking at that letter, I understood that something in my quiet, carefully constructed retirement had just broken. The flagpole was for my wife, Amelia. She had been a pilot, not professionally, but with a passion that bordered on the religious. Flying was her church, the cockpit her pew, the vast, empty blue her cathedral. She loved the sky. When she died, the sky felt empty to me too. So I built the flagpole, 20 feet of polished aluminum, set in a cubic yard of reinforced concrete. It was my memorial, my own small way of reaching up into the space she had loved. Every morning I raised the flag. Every evening I lowered it. A simple ritual, a quiet covenant with her memory. After a few minutes of silent observation, I walked back to my workshop. The smell of pine sap and WD-40 greeted me like an old friend. I pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, grabbed my evidence kit, a habit I'd never quite managed to shake, and returned. I photographed the letter from every angle. I documented the excessive tape, the precise placement. Then, with the surgical precision of a bomb disposal expert, I used a scalpel to slice it free, carefully preserving the tape and the paper. Back in the sterile light of my workshop, I laid it out on my drafting table. The paper was expensive, thick, with a watermark. The kind of paper someone buys because they think it makes their words weigh more. It was from the Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee, and it was signed, in a florid, self-important script, by Carol Ann Peterson, President, Architectural Review Committee, President, Neighborhood Watch, President, Committee for the Preservation of Beige Conformity, or so I imagined. The letter informed me that my flagpole was an unapproved structure, a violation of Covenant 17, subsection B, paragraph 4. I was being fined $200, and $200 more for every day the structure remained. The language was cold, boilerplate, but underneath it, I could feel her smug satisfaction, her absolute certainty of her own authority. Carol Ann. She lived 3 houses down in a McMansion that was perpetually, aggressively beige. She drove a white luxury SUV the size of a small tank and wore clothes that screamed, "I have a long-suffering husband with an excellent dental plan." Her perfume always arrived a full 10 seconds before she did, a chemical-sweet cloud of industrial-strength gardenia that clung to the air like a toxic spill. When she spoke to you, it was always with a slight, patronizing tilt of her head. Her voice a low purr that could turn into a venomous hiss in a split second. Her condescension was a physical force, an atmospheric pressure you could feel pressing down on you. She had terrorized the neighborhood for years. There was the saga of the Miller's basketball hoop, which she claimed lowered property values with its inner-city aesthetic. The war over the Garcia's wind chimes, which she deemed a source of acoustic pollution. She ruled our quiet suburban enclave with an iron fist wrapped in a cashmere glove. People feared her. They had been bullied into submission, fined into compliance. They grumbled in private but fell silent whenever her white SUV whispered past. I had managed to stay off her radar. I was quiet. I kept to myself. I was the old widower in the house with the immaculate garden, a ghost in the suburban machine. She had likely seen me as a non-entity, a harmless old man, big mistake, huge. I read the letter again, $200 a day. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. It wasn't about the flagpole. It was never about the thing itself. It was about control. It was about reminding everyone who was in charge. She had targeted my memorial to Amelia not because it was an eyesore, but because it was important to me. She had sensed a vulnerability, a point of leverage, and she was applying pressure. It was a classic bully tactic, a systems failure in our little community's social engineering. A quiet, cold rage began to build in me. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was the kind of rage I used to feel when I'd find a sheared bolt or a cracked wing spar that had been missed on 3 consecutive inspections. It was a methodical fury. The anger of a man who sees a problem that needs to be solved, a system that needs to be dismantled, analyzed, and corrected. Permanently. I turned to the heavy oak file cabinet in the corner of my workshop. Inside were the logbooks from my career. Decades of meticulous handwritten notes, diagrams, and calculations. Every investigation I ever conducted was in there, bound in black leather. I pulled out a fresh, empty logbook. On the first page, in neat block letters, I wrote, Project Nightingale, Amelia's favorite bird. Underneath, I wrote the date, the time, and the inciting incident. Receipt of hostile communication regarding memorial structure. My war with Carol Ann Peterson had begun, and she had no idea what kind of battle she had just picked. She saw an old man. She was about to meet a federal inspector with a 50,000-hour flight time in navigating bureaucracy and a PhD in finding the breaking point of entitled tyrants. The first phase of any investigation is data acquisition. For the next week, I became a ghost. I didn't answer her increasingly shrill letters, which started arriving daily via certified mail. I let the fines accumulate in a neat pile on my desk. The theoretical debt was now over $1,000. It felt unreal, like monopoly money. It meant nothing, because I knew I would never pay it. Instead, I worked. My days fell into a familiar rhythm. Coffee at 0500, review the project log, set the day's objectives. Objective 1 was a complete survey of the enemy. I set up 3 small, high-definition surveillance cameras, the kind used for monitoring wildlife. One was disguised as a birdhouse, aimed at the street, giving me a clear view of her house. Another was hidden in a dense azalea bush, covering my own front yard and the flagpole. The third was a mobile unit I used to document her patterns, her departures, her arrivals, the contractors who came and went, the click, click, click of her acrylic nails on her phone as she sat in her SUV, engine idling, surveying her domain. It was all logged, time-stamped, filed. Objective 2 was a deep dive into the legal framework. I spent hours at the county records office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. I pulled the original plat maps for our development, dating back to its creation in the late 1980s. I photocopied every page of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and Rs. I read them until my eyes burned. I highlighted, I annotated, I cross-referenced. I treated them like an aircraft's maintenance records, searching for inconsistencies, for loopholes, for the single overlooked detail that could ground the whole operation. I discovered, as expected, that the rules were a tangled mess of legalese, written to grant maximum discretionary power to the Architectural Review Committee, which was to say, to Carol Ann. A clause here allowed them to regulate any structure not attached to the primary residence. A clause there gave them authority over matters of aesthetic harmony. It was a tyrant's charter, designed to be selectively and arbitrarily enforced. During this time, Carol Ann escalated. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my door. Then came the phone calls, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "Frank, darling," she'd purr. "We're all just so worried this has gotten out of hand. Just take it down, and we can make all these nasty fines disappear." I never answered. I let the machine get it. Her voice, recorded and stored, became another piece of evidence. Exhibit C. Audio logs of attempted coercion. My most valuable intelligence, however, came from Mr. Henderson. He lived across the street from me, a retired accountant who had been in the neighborhood since the first foundations were poured. Henderson was the man who noticed things. He sat on his porch every afternoon, ostensibly reading the paper, but I knew he was observing. He saw the new tires on the teenager's car 2 houses down and knew his parents had caved. He saw the moving van at the corner and knew the Wilsons had finally sold. He was a human surveillance network. One evening, I brought him a bottle of bourbon, and we sat on his porch. I didn't have to ask much. "Carol Ann," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "That woman thinks the HOA is her personal fiefdom. You see that new retaining wall she had built last month? The fancy stonework?" I nodded. It was an ostentatious thing, completely out of character with the rest of the neighborhood. "Paid for by our dues," Henderson said, his voice flat. "Saw the invoice myself. The landscapers left it in their truck, plain as day. Billed to the HOA Common Area Improvement Fund. Her yard ain't a common area, Frank." He took a slow sip. "She's been doing it for years. Skimming, using the HOA's contractors for her personal projects and burying the costs in the budget. No one ever challenges her. The board is stacked with her little cronies, all too scared of her to say a word." This was it. Not just a breach of protocol, but criminal fraud. Wire fraud, mail fraud. This elevated the problem from a civil dispute to a federal case. My quiet rage sharpened into a fine, cold point. The mission parameters had changed. This was no longer just about defending my flagpole. This was about dismantling a corrupt regime. I spent the next 2 days building a comprehensive financial analysis based on Henderson's intel. I cross-referenced the dates of her improvements with the HOA's public budget reports. The numbers lined up perfectly. A pattern of systematic embezzlement. I added it to the logbook. Project Nightingale was now a multi-front war, but I still needed the key. The single piece of leverage that would make my counterattack undeniable, my victory absolute. The legal nuclear bomb. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, buried deep in the county archives, I found it. It wasn't in the HOA files. It was older. Much older. It was a property easement survey from 1972, 15 years before the first house in our development was even built. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a pale blue. It smelled of time itself. It was a federal document, an aviation easement. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. I spread the map out on the table, my hands trembling slightly. The easement granted the United States government, specifically the Federal Aviation Administration, perpetual and unrestricted rights to the airspace above a 500-foot-wide corridor. It was for the VOR navigation beacon located on a hill 5 miles to the west. The corridor cut directly across our neighborhood. It passed directly over my property, and a small but legally significant corner of Carol Ann Peterson's property. The language was beautiful, exquisite in its absolute authority. It superseded any and all local ordinances, private agreements, or homeowners' association covenants. The federal government's right to that airspace was paramount. The document was a ghost from the past, a forgotten covenant that trumped everything. This was more than a loophole. This was a legal singularity, a black hole that would swallow her entire case. I sat there in the dusty silence of the records office, and I started to laugh. A low, quiet chuckle that grew into a full, shoulders-shaking laugh of pure, unadulterated joy. The librarian gave me a stern look. I didn't care. I had found the stress fracture. Now it was time to apply the pressure. The next phase was engineering the solution. Victory couldn't just be defensive, it had to be offensive, it had to be total. I wasn't just going to get her to back down. I was going to strip her of her power, expose her crimes, and salt the earth where her little empire stood. My plan had 3 components: legal, psychological, and financial. The legal component was built around the aviation easement. My flagpole was no longer just a memorial. It was now a critical piece of navigational infrastructure. I spent a weekend in my workshop. I installed a certified, FAA-approved anemometer and a weather vane on the top. I added a small, solar-powered, low-intensity obstruction light, the kind used to mark towers near airfields. I ran the data cables down the interior of the pole to a small, weatherproof housing at the base containing a transmitter. Then I called my old friend, Dave Riley. Dave was still at the FAA, a regional director with more acronyms in his title than a bowl of alphabet soup. "Frank, you old ghost," he boomed over the phone. "Thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth. What can I do for you?" I explained the situation, calmly and methodically. I sent him a scan of the 1972 easement. I sent him the technical specifications of my new weather station and VFR navigational marker. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then I heard him chuckle. "Frank, you magnificent bastard. You want me to officially register this thing, don't you? I want it in the federal database, Dave. I want it on the sectional charts. I want it to be more official than the White House Christmas tree." "Consider it done," he said. "The paperwork will be a nightmare. But for you, I'll make it happen. I'll even draft a letter for you on official letterhead, explaining the federal protections afforded to registered navigational aids. I'll be sure to include the relevant statutes. Title 18. Section 32 of the U.S. Code is a personal favorite. 10 years in federal prison for tampering. That should get her attention. The psychological component was designed for maximum impact. I was going to give Carol Ann exactly what she wanted: compliance. But on my terms. My flagpole wasn't coming down. It was being upgraded. I was turning a symbol of her persecution into a monument of her defeat. An untouchable, federally protected middle finger pointed directly at her beige McMansion. Every time she looked out her window, she would see it. Not just a flagpole, but a symbol of her own impotence. I also started flying a new flag. Beneath the American flag, I added the official flag of the Federal Aviation Administration. It was a subtle, institutional touch, a quiet declaration of whose rules I was playing by now. The final component was the financial attack. With Henderson's eyewitness accounts and my analysis of the HOA budgets, I had a strong case for embezzlement. But I needed undeniable proof. I needed bank records. Getting them would be impossible without a subpoena. So I took a different route. I filed a detailed, anonymous tip with two separate federal agencies, the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. I laid out the entire scheme, citing specific budget line items, dates, and contractor names. Mail fraud, using the U.S. mail to send fraudulent invoices, and HOA communications was the hook that would get the postal inspectors interested. They are notoriously tenacious. They are the honey badgers of federal law enforcement. They don't let go. With all the pieces in place, I waited. I let the fines accumulate. The total was now over $5,000. I received a final certified letter from Carol Ann. It was an official notice of a special HOA meeting. The agenda had only one item: vote on placing a lien against the property of Frank Miller for non-payment of fines and continued violation of Covenant 17. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the community clubhouse. Her stage, her arena. She was planning a public execution. Perfect. A public stage was exactly what I needed for my final act. I spent the weekend preparing. I put together a PowerPoint presentation. It was crisp, professional, and utterly damning. Each slide was a carefully calibrated payload, designed to dismantle her authority piece by piece. I rehearsed my speech, keeping it calm, factual, and devoid of emotion. Engineering calm, we used to call it. The colder you are, the more people listen. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with a mixture of cheap Chardonnay, stale coffee, and Carol Ann's gardenia perfume. It was a cloying, suffocating smell. She stood at a lectern at the front of the room, beaming, radiating an aura of absolute power. Her board members, two nervous-looking women and a man who looked like he had long ago given up the will to live, sat behind her like hostages. She began the meeting with a flourish, her voice dripping with false regret. "It is with a heavy heart," she began, "that we must address the unfortunate situation with one of our neighbors, Mr. Frank Miller." All eyes turned to me. I sat in the back row, my laptop bag at my feet. I gave a slight, neutral nod. She launched into a 15-minute tirade, detailing my brazen disregard for the community's aesthetic standards. She held up copies of the violation notices. She announced the total amount of the fines, $5,800, to a series of gasps from the audience. She spoke of the importance of rules, of order, of protecting their property values from rogue elements. It was a masterful performance of self-righteous indignation. Therefore, she concluded, her voice ringing with triumph, I call for a vote to authorize our legal counsel to place a lien on Mr. Miller's property. Hands started to go up around the room, a testament to her power and the community's fear. Before you vote, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Every head swiveled back to me. Carol Ann's smile tightened. Mr. Miller, this is not a debate. You had your chance to comply. I believe the bylaws state that a homeowner facing a lien has the right to address the board, I said calmly. Page 47, Article 9, Section C. A murmur went through the crowd. Her face flushed slightly. She had been caught off guard. Very well, she hissed. You have 5 minutes. I'll only need 4, I said. I walked to the front of the room, opened my laptop, and connected it to the projector. The screen flickered to life. My first slide appeared. It was a high-resolution scan of the 1972 Federal Aviation Easement. I had highlighted the relevant corridor in bright red. This, I began, my voice steady, is a federal document that predates this HOA by 15 years. It grants the FAA unrestricted dominion over the airspace above our properties. It supersedes every rule in your book. Slide 2. A crisp, professional photograph of my flagpole, now adorned with its scientific instruments. The title read, FAA Registered Navigational Aid and Weather Station, ID number 74B-NINER-ALPHA. My unapproved structure, I continued, is in fact a federally registered and protected piece of aviation infrastructure. It provides critical weather data to pilots using the VOR beacon 5 miles from here. Slide 3. The official letter from Dave Riley on FAA letterhead, his signature bold and clear at the bottom. I used my laser pointer to highlight a single sentence. Interference with or attempts to remove a registered navigational aid is a federal offense. Carol Ann was no longer smiling. Her face was a mask of confusion and disbelief. Slide 4. The text was large and stark. United States Code, Title 18, Section 32, Destruction of Aircraft or Aircraft Facilities. Penalty, up to 20 years in federal prison. A collective gasp went through the room. People were shifting in their seats, looking from the screen to Carol Ann, whose face had gone a pale, waxy color. So to be clear, I said, turning to face her directly, your campaign of harassment and your attempt to place a lien on my property is, in fact, an attempt to interfere with a federal facility. Your fines are void. Your authority on this matter is non-existent. Any further action you take against me or this structure will be reported to the Department of Justice. I let that hang in the air for a moment. The silence was absolute. Then I clicked to the next slide. But let's talk about authority, I said, my tone shifting from defensive to offensive. Let's talk about how the HOA's money is being spent. The slide was titled, Financial Irregularities, a Case Study. It showed a picture of Carol Ann's new stone retaining wall. Next to it was a scanned copy of the invoice from Evergreen Landscaping, billed to the HOA. As you know, I said to the crowd, our dues are meant for the maintenance of common areas, the pool, the front gate, the small park on the corner. They are not meant for improving the private residence of the board president. The next slide was a detailed spreadsheet. On one side, a list of dates. On the other, a list of expenditures from the HOA budget, cross-referenced with photos Mr. Henderson had provided. The new sod for her lawn, the Japanese maple trees, the new sprinkler system. It was all there, a clear and undeniable pattern of embezzlement totaling over $40,000 in the last 2 years alone. This isn't just a violation of the bylaws, I said, my voice like ice. This is fraud, specifically mail fraud and wire fraud, as you use the U.S. Postal Service to send and receive these fraudulent invoices and HOA communications. That's when her composure finally shattered. It didn't crack. It exploded. Lies! She shrieked, her voice cracking, her face contorted in a mask of pure rage and panic. This is slander! It's all fabricated! You can't prove any of this! Oh, I think they can, I said, gesturing toward the back of the room. As if on cue, the double doors of the clubhouse swung open. 2 men and a woman in dark suits entered. They didn't look like local cops. They had the quiet, unshakable confidence of federal agents. One of them held up a badge. "Carol Ann Peterson?" the lead agent said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Agent Davies with the FBI. This is Agent Cho and Inspector Riley from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement." The color drained completely from Carol Ann's face. The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of the projector fan. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes pleading, but she found no allies. Her cronies on the board were staring at their shoes, trying to shrink into their chairs. She tried to run. She made a mad dash for a side exit, but Agent Cho was faster, cutting her off. As they put the handcuffs on her, she began to scream, a wild, incoherent torrent of threats and denials. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a system being corrected, the sound of a stress fracture finally giving way to total structural failure. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Carol Ann's case was airtight. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, she pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 3 years in a federal correctional facility. The court ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, forcing the sale of her beige McMansion and her white SUV. Her husband, who it turned out was just as much a victim as the rest of us, filed for divorce the day after her sentencing. The HOA was in shambles, its leadership gone, its finances a wreck. In the vacuum, the community turned to me. Reluctantly, I agreed to act as interim president. My first official act was to propose a motion to permanently dissolve the Architectural Review Committee. It passed unanimously. My second was to hire a forensic accountant to recover every last cent Carol Ann had stolen. We recovered over $60,000, including penalties and interest. At the next community meeting, I proposed that we use the recovered funds not to pave the roads or replant the petunias at the front gate, but to do something lasting. We established the Amelia M. Miller Aviation Scholarship. It's a fund dedicated to helping young women from our local high school pursue careers in aviation and aeronautical engineering. Every year, we give out a grant that covers the full cost of a private pilot's license. My flagpole still stands. It's a permanent fixture now, a quiet landmark in our neighborhood. The FAA flag still flies proudly beneath Old Glory. Most days, it's just a flagpole, a memorial, a quiet tribute to the woman I loved. But sometimes I see new residents looking at it, maybe wondering about its story, and I see the old-timers like Mr. Henderson give it a knowing glance. They know it's more than just a flagpole. It's a reminder. A reminder that you should never, ever underestimate the quiet man who just wants to be left alone. Especially when that man spent 30 years figuring out exactly what it takes to make things fall out of the sky. Carol Ann thought she was just picking a fight over a piece of metal on a lawn. She never realized she was grounding herself permanently. She applied the pressure, and I just made sure I was there to document the catastrophic failure. And it was, from an engineering perspective, a truly beautiful thing to watch.